When you came to Swamiji, what were your first thoughts and how was that meeting?
Okay, I'd have to go back a little because I was introduced to the whole concept of, let's say, yoga, meditation when I was 18 years old. So that was in 1969. And before that, I was probably on the top list of the most ignorant people, on this planet. I knew nothing about anything. And I remember the one girl who was telling me about yoga. When I was listening, I couldn't sort of. She said, you have to change your life, and you have to find yourself." And my reaction was, I didn't know I was lost. So how do I do that? She said, well, okay, first you have to start yoga. Second, you have to start meditation. And she said, and third, you have to become a vegetarian. I said, whoa, okay, the first two I can do. The second one, I was a ferocious carnivore. I must have been a tiger in my last life or something. That's what I thought. But what I saw in people who were doing yoga and meditation was something very unique. I didn't see that in any of my worldly friends because we were involved in surfing and music and, the 60s. But I started and I was drawn to Maharishi Mahesh Yogi because he had already had this influence with the Beatles and I was into music. So I learned transcendental meditation. And that immediately fascinated me. It touched a core in me. And I remember on the first day that I was initiated, my teacher took us to dinner and he had a photo album of his teacher training course, which he did in Rishikesh. And as he was going, showing us these pictures in Rishikesh with these some famous people in 1969, he opened the book and there was a picture of Maharishi and Swami Lakshmanju. And I immediately said, who is that? It touched something in me. He said, oh, that's a master from Kashmir. Maharishi took us there. We spent a beautiful month in Kashmir because it was too hot in Rishikesh. And one day he took us to Maharishi's ashram, and it was on his birthday. There were thousands of people there. He said, but he's very recluse. He has a few disciples. And then he said, I think they live in caves and they just practice Kundalini yoga. That's what he said. But that planted a seed. So a year later, I became a teacher of transcendental meditation. I went to Europe. I studied with Maharishi. And it was very interesting because my second meeting with Maharishi, he said to me, he said, you should read some Shastras. You should read some Shastras. And when you go back to Australia, you should learn some Sanskrit. And I said, what Shastras should I read? And Maharishi knew what my future was. He said, well, you should read the Shiva Sutras of Kashmir Shaivism. You should read the Puranas. You should read the Vedas. You should have a good background. And I was handed a copy of the Shiva Sutras, just the English meaning. And on top it had Shiva Sutras by Bal Brahmachari Swami Lakshmanju of Ishwar Ashram, Gupta Ganga, Srinagar. So there was the second seed. I saw Swamiji name, and I read those sutras over and over. They became my mantra. I would just read them over and over, and I was mesmerized. Then in 1980, after being a teacher of transcendental meditation, I met Maharishi in India, and I said, Maharishi, I want your permission to go and study with Swami Lakshmanju in Kashmir. I knew nothing about whether I would be accepted or. And Maharishi looked at me, knowing full well what my dharma was in this whole world, and he said, teach transcendental meditation for one more year, then you can go. So a year later, in 1981, 82, I arrived in Kashmir in the winter. And Swamiji was actually in Jammu at that time because he used to spend the winter avoiding the supreme, the severe cold. So I got there, and there were a few disciples, Kashmiris, and that around the ashram. And I was so enthusiastic. I wanted to meet Swamiji, and they all said, "Oh, look, be relaxed. Don't be too eager. Swamiji is not accepting any new disciples. You know, his health is a little bit down. He's age 74 at that time. I said, that's okay if I just have darshan once, because I believe he's a fully enlightened yogi. That'll be enough for me. So a month later, Swamiji arrived, and I went to the ashram. And it was a winter day. There were only 20 or 30 people there. And we all had this delicious Kashmiri tea in his presence. From the moment I saw him, I felt something very strong. I didn't know what it was, but I felt something very, very deep, a connection that's untouchable. And we were there. We had our tea. Maharishi Swamiji looked at me at something he said, and I started laughing. And he looked up at him. I said, "Oh," he said, "you laugh just like Mahesh Yogi." And I said, "Yes, Swamiji, I am his disciple." And he said, "Good." He said, "Maharishi was my very dear friend." He said he was the first yogi who really understood my experience and my knowledge. And then we had tea and everything, and then it was time to leave, and it was very unique because this was Swamiji's house. But he opened once a week on Sunday. So Swamiji walked away to the door leading out into the laneway, and everybody filed past, and he said and whispered a few things to everybody, but he didn't say anything to me. So everybody stood in the lane. Instead of walking away, they stood there, and he closed the door, and everybody waited till they heard the key inserted, and they would hear it hit the lock. And they knew, okay, we'll see Swamiji next week. Next Sunday, it'll be 1 week. And as the key locked, I thought, oh, you know, maybe I only see Swamiji once. Maybe that's it. And this kind of wave went through me of fear, of all-encompassing. I put all of my eggs in one basket, and suddenly this might be it. As people had warned me, don't. And suddenly the key unlocked again, and the door opened, and Swamiji looked across. There I was standing with 20 devotees. I was at the back because I'm quite tall. Everybody's head was up to here. And he looked at me. He said, "You will come again, won't you?" And that was the seed. That was the fulfillment of my life, I thought. So I went back the next week on the Sunday. Again, I saw people in the town. They said, "Oh, you came on Sunday. That's very good. But don't get your hopes up because, we've seen people, they're here for a while and they stay for 3 or 4 months and they come on Sunday, but then eventually they leave." The very next Sunday, as we were going past Swamiji at the door, he said to me, "Can you come on Tuesday? And I would like to talk with you because," he said, "on Monday I'm in silence. I don't see anybody." And I said, "Yes, yes, of course, I'll come on Tuesday. What time?" He said, "Come at 10 o'clock, like that." So I left and I thought, my gosh, I'm going to go Tuesday. He's going to put his hand on my head. I'm going to be enlightened. I'm going to have moksha on Wednesday. These illusions of grandeur. So I went on the Tuesday very excited, made sure my clothes were clean, everything. I was so excited. And when I sat in this little tea house that Swamiji had, where he did a lot of his interviews and things, he said, "So tell me about your life." I started to talk, and the way he was looking at me, he knew everything. He knew everything that I'd done, where I'd been, not just this, maybe many lifetimes. When I told him that I was a civil engineer, he said, "Oh, do you know hands-on? Are you just theoretical, or hands-on work?" I said, "Yes, Swamiji." He said, "Well," he said, "I have some work to do here in the ashram. Would you be free to come and do some work for me? For instance, I have a cow shed there which I'm demolishing, and I want to build a Havan. I'll give you carpenters and masons, and you can be in charge of that project." I I felt, my gosh, really, this is amazing. So, put it in a nutshell, for the next 9 years until Swamiji left this world, I was in the ashram practically 6 days a week, working, gardening. Eventually, when John and Denise left, because they were so close to Swamiji, when they left in the mid 80s, I became like Swamiji's personal secretary, driving him shopping. And what what happened was my reason for going there initially was to get this knowledge, but I wanted knowledge for power. It was all wrong. It was ego. I wanted to be really smart and tell everybody what I knew. And Swami didn't allow that to happen. He waited and waited and waited till that whole thing was gone. And then in 1988, he hardly let me go to the lectures. I would go to lectures, and as soon as a lecture finished, when the interesting questions would come up, he would look at me and say, George, don't you have to rush to the carpenters? They haven't finished that job. And I would get up and rush out. This continually for up till 1988. And then one day Swamiji said, by John's grace, John had asked Swamiji if I could work on the transcriptions. There were over 1,000 hours of recorded uh, text that Swamiji had done. And because I had a basic, very basic background in Sanskrit, could read Devanagari script, Swamiji said, okay, I want you now to start working on my transcriptions and make sure that everything that I've said is correct. So that was the start of my learning curve. And by then I'd already lost this idea that, that knowledge for power. This was knowledge for liberation. So for the next 20 years, even after Swamiji left this world in 91, I spent every spare moment transcribing, first by hand. Then I got my first Apple Macintosh computer in 95. And I finished all of the transcriptions by 2008. So that was my introduction. And I had no airs about being there with Swamiji. He had a small inner circle of people who I knew were there, and I felt I was a little bit on the peripheral of that. But one day, once a year, Swamiji would allow Denise and John to take some photographs of him just sitting in the garden, and they would sit with him and everything. I was off doing some work somewhere. I'll share this because it's kind of sweet. I was off doing some work, and Swamiji suddenly looked. He said, "George, come over and sit next to me. I want a photograph with you." I wasn't even prepared. I had these kind of rough-looking clothes on, and let me see if it's there. Okay, here. So I went and sat down next to Swamiji, making sure I didn't sort of mess up. I was sitting on the edge of the little arsen where he was sitting, and I felt that I'd been accepted by him some way or other. I wasn't thinking about acceptance, but I thought, okay, this is unique. Years later, I found out that Swamiji never took a photograph with anybody that he didn't fully approve. It was very, very interesting. Scholars would come, sometimes, erudite scholars who have written books and everything, and they would request a photograph, and Swamiji would say, "Oh, I'm not feeling well today. No, it won't be good to have a photograph." Or they were very, very great privilege to have had your photograph taken with Swamiji. So, and a picture paints 1,000 words. That was me. I was doing some work in the garden at that time. So that for me was like, okay. And I wasn't thinking about whether you were accepted or not, because I learned more just being around Swamiji and watching how he behaved day to day with people than anything in those first 6-7 years. Just seeing his naturalness and his ability to remain hidden, his ability to do something quite miraculous and then cover it over and bring everybody back to a kind of mundane existence where you didn't feel like overwhelmed.